Hi, this is Carson with Troy, and I have with me Dan Moren. Now, Dan is a prolific writer for various magazines and online sites, as well as a prolific podcaster. Let me see, I counted six podcasts.
Too many, some would say.
Too many. But that's not the reason why he's here. The reason why he's here is because he's the author of the Galactic Cold War, which is a four-book series with looks like a couple of short stories that you've put out, as well as All Souls Lost. Dan, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about the books.
Sure, that's a fairly succinct introduction. I am many things, including a technology journalist, which I have been for almost 20 years, a podcaster on both tech and pop culture, and as you said, a science fiction and fantasy novelist. I have been doing that since 2017. My debut, The Caledonian Gambit, came out in 2017 from Talos Press, followed by the Galactic Cold War series from Angry Robot Books, which started in 2019. And Also is Lost, I most put out last year as a standalone supernatural detective novel, which was published through my agency, JABberwocky. Um, yeah, in addition to that, I've done a few self-published short stories as part of the Galactic Cold War series. And yeah, I do podcasts on everything from technology. I have a show called Clockwise that is a 30-minute tech show I do every week, to pop culture. I do a show called A Complicated Profession that's about Star Wars TV shows with my wife and one of my best friends. All that stuff I've been doing since at least 2010 or so. So I've been doing a lot. I'm busy. I have like three part-time jobs, which is a weird world to live in, and sometimes very stressful, but also a great and flexible career, which is really nice.
That's fantastic. So you tech journalist for 20 years, you said, and the fiction writing has come a little bit later. How was that transition? Was it kind of difficult, or how was that?
Well, I mean, I've been a fiction writer even longer than I've been a tech journalist, but in terms of getting, stuff published, obviously that took a lot longer. I mean, I started writing fiction basically when I was old enough to write, way back when I was a kid in elementary school. I was really into it. When I was in high school, a friend and I started an online electronic magazine that we ran on the web, which was back in 1994. There were not a lot of other online magazines at that point. And we were always into sort of sci-fi and fantasy and weird and horror and all that stuff. So that was always my wheelhouse. But I kind of put that on a back burner after a while because, I really was like, oh, I'm never going to make a living at that. So, I should find something else to do. And writing something, again, I've always loved, and I've always been passionate about technology. And so I sort of moved from a career in technology first. I worked briefly as a web developer and a IT person way back when I first got out of college. And then I sort of transitioned from there to writing about technology, which I started in 2006. And in the background, I was always working on some novels. Like I finished my first novel in like 2004, as that I had started. I think maybe I even started as like a National Novel Writing Month thing, but I sort of kept at it. Um, and I got those rejected from agents and stuff like that. And then I got to put it on the side again as my technology journalism career took off. And in my back of my head, I was like, well, maybe this will be helpful someday in terms of transitioning back to fiction writing and doing more fiction writing. And I think the biggest sort of thing that it helped me with was it made me write every day. I was writing stuff, multiple pieces when I first started every day. And just the act of being able to do that and do that for so long really kept me not only invested in writing, but also helped me hone my skills. Like I got better at it because I was doing it so much. You can't help but get better at it. So I think around 2009 or so, I was like, oh, I'm really gonna give another crack to this whole novel writing thing. And I started working on an idea I'd had for many years. And it still took a while. I mean, I didn't finish that book, draft wise for probably a year or two. And even after that, I went through a whole bunch of different revisions. Um, Eventually met the man who would become my agent, Joshua Bilmes, at a conference, and he sort of took the draft I had and was like, "Hey, this has potential. It's not there yet, but like maybe we can turn it into something that is actually saleable." And he and I went back and forth on that for many years, and eventually that yielded a publishing contract, and it came out in 2017. So it's sort of a gradient of like experience for me, where it's always been there in the background. It's not like I made like a hard pivot or anything. Writing has always been part of my life, and so in fiction, especially science fiction, fantasy, that's always been a huge part for me. So I think that it dovetailed nicely with a career in tech journalism. It's not necessarily one directly informs the other. It's not like I take all my tech journalism and put it into my books, but just the practice it gets me into, like, of getting used to writing. It's rare that a day goes by where I don't write something.
You brought up a couple good points. The first one being like it forces you to write every day. So this podcast is primarily for writers and artists and anybody else who wants to do like science fiction and fantasy kind of creation stuff, whether that's leatherworking, blacksmithing, whatever. And what you just said, I think, is a golden nugget. When people want to get into something or become proficient in something, it's doing it every day.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you mentioned you met Joshua at conference. How was that? How did that pitch go? Like, was he open to it? Like, how did you bring it up?
I so I actually met him through another one of his clients at the time, who I had gone to like I'd read some blog posts by this guy and had thought it was interesting, and then I sat down with him at a coffee klatch at a con, and he's like, "Oh, you seem like you got a good head on your shoulders, and like you could probably make a go of this." And then Joshua, who was his agent, happened to come up and he introduced us, and I knew who he was because I'd submitted my first novel to him back in 2004 and had gotten rejected, and so I was like, "Oh, well, this is great." And so we ended up chatting a little bit, and I think it definitely helped my case that I was a working writer at that point. I think I was I don't know if I was a senior editor yet at the magazine I worked at the time, but I was certainly in the editorial staff. And so, it proved that I had a professional writing career. I knew what I was doing. I could string some words together. And we had some similar interests in a few things. And so we kind of like talked about that. And at the end of our conversation, I was like, I've got a novel. I'd love to send it to you. And he's like, all right, yeah, here's my email. And I've seen him at many conferences since then with other people making those pitches, and he is very welcoming to them. He is also a person who is very blunt with his opinions and very forthright and is not going to, sugarcoat it if he feels like a thing isn't for him. So I was lucky enough to like get to a point where he felt like it was a thing that he could actually turn around and get published. And he was right about that. And I've learned to trust his instincts on that front. But it was certainly intimidating. I won't lie. Like, especially having in my back pocket the memory of like, there's no way he remembers the terrible novel that he rejected from me, but I sure do.
Right. And that's how we met. Joshua introduced us, and he's
Yes.
a
No.
great guy. So if anybody's out there that sees him at a convention or a writers conference or something, he's very personable. He'll listen, and like you said, he is very blunt. So be prepared. If he doesn't like your work, he'll tell you.
He'll tell you. Yeah. Yeah. But he's very approachable. He's a very nice guy. So I do recommend that. It's a great way to sort of, conferences, if you can afford, if you have the ability to go to them, I do find they are often helpful just for making face-to-face contacts. Online. I spent a lot of time online. I've written online for years, done podcasts online for years, but it can often feel like very anonymous and very much a voice in the crowd. And there is something to being able to put a face with a name, right? Like that does have an element of usefulness to it.
Exactly. Speaking of cons, we met at Dragonstill last year.
Mm-hmm.
How often do you go to cons, or was that kind of like your first one?
That was my first Dragon Steel. I've gone to many cons for several years. It's cut down a bit. I have a 2-year-old, so my travel has gotten a little curtailed. But I still make an effort. I go every year to my local con. I'm based in Boston, so I go to BosCon there every year and have for I don't even remember how many years now. Probably close to a decade. I've traveled a little bit. I've gone to many of the World Cons in the last, well, not in the last several years, but in the last decade or so. I just went to the one in Glasgow this year, which was fantastic. And I've gone to other smaller cons in various places, on and off. I used to go to more 2 or 3 a year, and these days it's just been cut back for me due to kid responsibilities. But I try to make at least 1 or 2 every year. So I enjoyed Dragonsteel. That was my first time there, but I thought it was a really, really fun. And I say this as somebody who knows nothing of Brandon's work. My wife is a Brandon Sanderson reader. I am not a Brandon Sanderson reader. And so I was there watching everybody come by in costume. I was like, I have no idea what's going on, but I kind of love that. And everybody was really great and super excited about books. That was the best thing about going there. It was like people were like, yeah, I'm primarily here because I'm a Brandon fan, but like, I love books. Tell me about your book. And it's like, okay, great.
That's fantastic. Now, of course, writing is only one half of the story. You have to market. Well, you don't have to. Being a published author, like a traditionally published author, it's a little bit different for you than like an indie publisher. That's an indie author that has to market and stuff. You have a an agency that helps you with that. But at a convention, it's kind of up to you to
Right.
get your
Yeah.
books in readers' hands. Do you have like an elevator pitch, or how do you how do you get
Yeah.
people interested in your books?
It's tough. I will say I had not done hand selling of books in a long time, and I did start out feeling like, okay, I'm going to need an elevator pitch, and I realized very quickly I was not great at it. But as I watched, I was there with a bunch of other JABberwocky clients, which is my agency, and I watched several of them do it, and I kind of observed, and it made me over the course of the con really start honing my pitch and get better at it. And I thought by the end of the con, I was like, I've really got it down now. And I could sell other people's books too, like my other colleagues. And that was great. And then I went to Worldcon this year and did a launch event for my most recent book. And I had to get up on stage and talk for like 4 minutes about it. And was like, oh, I have entirely lost these skills in the last year that I have not done this. So the answer is yes, I had a great elevator pitch at the time. But I feel like if I tried to do it right now, it would go very badly.
Well, it's that writing every day type thing. Like if you don't use
Exactly.
that skill,
Yes.
like it goes
Exactly.
away.
It's gone. It's
Yeah.
gone. So
So tell us a little bit about the Galactic Cold War.
mm,
What was the genesis of it? Like, where'd you come up with the idea? Tell us a little bit about it.
sure. Yeah. So it was spawned by two things. This is the way I work. I take genres I love and I love to smash them together, which makes it sometimes hard to define. But for me, the Galactic Cold War came out of two things: my love of space operas and my love of Cold War spy fiction. And when I first started coming up with the idea, I had just been introduced to Lois McMaster Bujold's for Kozigan Saga, which are my favorite books of all time. They are fantastic science fiction space operas, huge, sprawling, all these characters, really interesting intrigue and science fiction elements and all this stuff. And I love that. I love that it made such a huge world. It was very immersive and very full of characters that were really memorable. And to me, the hallmark of a lot of great science fiction has characters that were really relatable. And I'm a very character driven writer. And so I thought what I liked the most about those was sort of the intrigue stuff, and I wanted to have something with more. And I've had a long love of Cold War spy fiction, the works of Jean Le Carré or Eric Ambler or Alistair MacLean or something like that. And I was like, oh, I wonder if there is like a story in this idea of can I transplant the Cold War atmosphere into a science fictional universe? And so the Galactic Cold War was sort of born out of that, which is this idea of it's several hundred years in the future. The galaxy has been divided up between these two superpowers. There are no aliens in it. It's just humans. But there is this faction called the Illyrican Empire, which has managed to conquer Earth and a bunch of its colonies. And then this smaller group called the Commonwealth, which is resisting against that. But the war has hit this stalemate. It's at an impasse. And so everything has devolved into this Cold War where, there are some like little skirmishes and the occasional incident that erupts, but a lot of it is about maintaining that status quo. And the books follow a team of covert operatives from the Commonwealth, led by Simon Kovalik, and they kind of see as their goal, winning this war seems foolhardy. What we want to do is try to prevent this war from turning into a shooting war and lots of people dying, because that will go really badly. And so it plays a little bit with sort of moral gray areas and who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. Is there such a thing in this universe as good guys and bad guys, or is it just a situation where we're trying to do the best with what we can? And so they end up in a bunch of different situations where they're trying to navigate these two factions. And a lot of times the people they're dealing with on the opposite side, they kind of have more in common with. It's like, hey, we're both here on the ground, we're working, and we're spies, we're on the opposite side, but like our higher ups are like back at home behind a desk. Like they don't know what it's like down here. And so they have to make these compromises in these deals. And I really enjoy that element of it because it has that sort of Berlin during the Cold War like feel to it. And that was always what I really enjoyed and found so interesting in those novels. So that's kind of like the broad idea of where all these stories were and came from. And like I said, I've been kind of had them in my head since I was in college, and it's taken me many years to get to the point of writing them all down. But I'm pretty happy with where I am.
That's amazing. Now, like you said, you've had this idea since college, and it sounded like you kind of put pen to paper or hands on keyboard or however you want to phrase it nowadays, for like a decade to get that first book out. Um, what kept you motivated, and like what was kind of the process? Like you went through many revisions. Like, did you ever feel like giving up?
Yeah, I mean, the dirty secret I think of being a writer is like there's a lot of times you feel like giving up. Even for me now, 6 books, published, and I'm working on a seventh, and I still some days I'm like, man, this is hard. Like, why am I doing this to myself? um, but I think for me, especially with that first book, there's a certain degree of proving it to yourself, like especially because I had felt like this was something I had spent so much of my life feeling that I wanted to do. And so the accomplishment of actually getting to that point, it kind of drove me. And I think at a certain point, I also realized, yeah, there's a lot of luck in this, but there's also to a certain degree no secret, no magic bullet, right? A lot of it was just, hey, it's buckling down and doing the work and doing it even when it's hard and doing it day after day. And that's something you can control, right? It's something you can actually choose. I'm going to do this rather than just sitting around and waiting for inspiration to strike. Oh, it never did, so I guess I never wrote that book. It's like, well, that's that's a choice you have made. And so I think that's part of the thing that kept me motivated about it was like, well, if at least I put all the work in, nobody can say I didn't try the best, right? Like even if the it doesn't break my way, I want to be able to look back and say like, well, I tried everything. I put my nose to the grindstone. I worked hard, and I did the work, and I got it done. And so I think that was sort of the big impetus that kept me going down that path was the idea that like this was a thing under my control, and I could choose to do it to the best of my ability. So yeah, so honestly, a lot of that first novel was written on weekends, on evenings. I mean, I was working a full-time job at the time, and so it was just something that I had to carve out the space for. And that there's also an element of that made it more valuable because it's like, well, I have to go. It's like going to the gym, right? It's like I gotta do something extra. I gotta take the extra time, finish my work, go to this other thing, work on this other task. It's not going to do itself. And so that was a thing that I had to work hard for, and because I had to work hard for it, I valued it more.
Right, you carved out that time, forcing yourself to do that every single day, every single weekend. How has your habits changed now? What do you do now to stay productive?
Man, it's hard, especially being a parent recently. I definitely find that an extra challenge. I'm lucky to have a very flexible schedule due to my life and my work. Like, I kind of am, a freelancer to a certain degree, so I am able to set my own schedule. And a big part of that is carving out time. One of the things I've done for a long time is I tend to work in coffee shops. I find that it makes me focus. If I'm at home, there are too many other temptations isn't quite the right word, but like obligations even like I should throw some laundry in, or like I should, oh man, that shelf is really dirty, I should clean that shelf. And being out and about and having a specific place to go feels like, again, trying to make that time valuable and being like, well, okay, I've only got 2 hours, like here I gotta get in, sit down, put some words down on the page. And still a struggle. I mean, like, especially there are tons of distractions now that I feel like were not as big a distraction in 15 years ago when I was first working on stuff, social media, or just news, whatever's going on in the world. Like there's a lot happening. Everything is very intense right now, and so I still do try to carve out like a couple hours in the morning to go and do work. And sometimes for me, sometimes I fail. Sometimes I do not get enough words. Like I don't get any words down, or I get a fraction of the number of words I want to do down, but I go back the next day, right? It's like I'm not like, hey, yesterday went poor, I should quit and give this up. It's like, no, I got to do better tomorrow, or I got to try to hit that goal tomorrow. And it's hard. It depends very much on the project that I'm working on at the time. Some of them obviously are more of a struggle than others, but um, I think just sticking with it, perseverance is like, again, it's one of those things that you can control. You can decide to do it. And ultimately, you can't make the writing good necessarily by doing that. But if you don't do the work, there will be no writing. So it doesn't matter.
Right. So you said I love goals. I love being able to plan and accomplish goals. I like that I guess that tick mark at the end of the day.
Mhm.
Um, Personal question, but like when you go write, what are do you have a word goal? Do you just have like an out like, okay, I'm gonna write for 2 hours and whatever happens happens?
I tr- I try to have a word goal. Sometimes I do. Um, I think for me, 1,000 word day is pretty good. That's like kind of what I aim for. If I go above that, great. I'm certainly not a person who stops myself because I don't usually feel that's a problem. So it will vary for me, but I think my average day will be somewhere between 500 and 2,000 depending on what I'm cranking on at the moment. Like sometimes you hit a groove and you just sort of ride it out and you're like, all right, I got 2,000 words down today. That's pretty good. That could be like a whole chapter in some cases. Some days you're like hammering tongs in at that 500 words. And it's like, I got to the end of the day. I was like, well, I'm going to have to be happy with that. I got something down. And the thing that I recently discovered that really actually made a difference for me in terms of how I think about that is as a writer, a lot of people come to me, they read a book that I've written and they're like, oh man, I love that book. I read it in 2 hours or something. And you're like, oh my God, it took me so long to write it. But goes back to the point of like when I am struggling with a passage and I feel like I am like tooth and nail working on getting 500 words down and it feels interminable to me to be getting that down. Somebody else reading that will read that in like 20 seconds. And it's like, okay, it didn't matter at the end of the day if it took me 3 weeks to write that chapter if somebody else read it in 10 minutes. Like it's that element of scale and proportionality I felt really sort of made something click in my head where it's like, this feels hard now, but just because it feels hard doesn't mean it's bad or that everybody else will read it and think, oh my gosh, that is so hard. That writing looked so hard. I kind of, it gave me some perspective on it. And I think it made me stress a little bit less about it because I was like, well, as hard as this takes me now, it's not going to matter to the person ultimately reading the book.
Every writer has felt that, where 500 words is a slog and 2,000 words sometimes is just a breeze, and
Yeah.
you don't know why. I don't know
It's so
why.
weird. It's
Yeah,
so weird. Brains are strange.
but going back to writing every day, if you sit down and all you can plug out is 250 words every single day, in a year you'll have a 100,000 word book. Like it's
Yeah,
not,
sure.
and writing one book a year is amazing. Like not a lot of people can do that. So don't, for those of you listening and watching,
Mm,
like don't be discouraged if you can only just do 250 words. If
yeah.
you continue every single day, like you can hit your goals.
It's all that matters, right? Is like it adds up. That's the biggest thing, honestly, is like if you only get a little bit down, that's fine. Next day do a little bit more. Like that's you just keep going. It's a
Yeah,
marathon.
exactly. Now, looking at your podcast,
Mhm.
um, very relatable um to science fiction fantasy. Like you have one a complicated profession about Star Wars, superhero TVs called Biff, not playing just general movies. What were some of your ideas going into these podcasts? Of course, you have a game show, which doesn't look like you have recorded in a while.
I know I've actually got like a planning thing for the next episode. That's another one of those things that just fallen casualty to a limited amount of time.
Right, like you
Uh,
can't do everything you want to do.
yeah, believe me, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So a lot of these are things. In 2010, some of my friends started a podcasting network called Incomparable. This was a lot of people I worked with or were colleagues that, if not like directly in my business, were like kind of adjacent. And it kind of grew into this big podcast network where we just all liked, nerdy pop culture stuff. And so I've had a lot of great opportunities to do shows about topics I'm really excited about. And then I've had opportunities to start shows. And a lot of times for me, it's really about the people I'm working with and the people I am doing shows with, and about the chemistry and the dynamic there. So, for example, the show Not Playing, which I started with my friend Lex many years ago, started out because we used to make fun of him for like there would be these really popular movies that he had never seen. And I was like, okay, we got to sit down with you and watch these movies and then talk about them. And it was when I also like, despite the fact that I'm a big pop culture nerd, I had to admit, like, oh, when I was a kid, I missed out on a lot of these movies. I didn't see them either because I was too young at the time, or it just never, the situation never arose. So we started to have this almost like cultural exchange where we'd be like, all right, here are the movies I saw, here are the movies you saw. And we'd watch the movies that like one or both of us hadn't seen. But I think at the end, it was because Lex and I are good friends and we really enjoyed talking about these things that is kind of why we decided to actually start a podcast about it. And Similarly, the show Biff that I do, which I actually just recorded just before we did this, I recorded an episode of that. My friends John Moltz and Guy English and I all really got into the show Arrow when it started way back on the CW, and like we were just texting about it, and we're like, oh, we should start a show. We should just get online and talk about it a little bit. And so we started doing that, and then it kind of grew from there. Where we're like, well, you know, we want to talk about some of these other superhero shows. And then Arrow ended, and we're like, well, we should do something else. And so we started in on like just doing sort of superhero TV shows, MCU TV shows, movies, etc. And it's just they're really good friends of mine. We love nerding out and talking about these things, and I think that's just the success of that is people enjoy our dynamic. And similarly, A Complicated Profession, which is my Star Wars show. I love Star Wars. You can probably see, since we're on video here, you can see my Empire Strikes Back poster. I got a lightsaber over there, all the Star Wars Lego stuff. Surprise, I'm a nerd. I like Star Wars. But I started doing that as a show covering The Mandalorian when it started. And then I would get different guests every week. And like, it was fun to like talk to different people about it. But you know, it also got kind of draining in terms of like, I got to find another guest and book another guest. And every week is a different dynamic. And, you know, most of them were friends of mine, but occasionally it was people I didn't know. And so you couldn't tell. It was like, is this going to be a good episode or not? And then as a kind of on a whim, I asked my wife, who is also a big Star Wars nerd, like, oh, do you want to be on the season finale with me? And we had a really fun time. And then I was also doing shows with my friend Tony, who I've known since I was in elementary school, and is also a big Star Wars nerd. And at some point, like I was doing shows with both of them. I was like, well, maybe the three of us should just do it as a show. And like, I think we just hit on like a amazingly fun dynamic where we are somewhat bizarre and weird and like go off on these really random tangents, but like people really enjoy it and respond to it. And I don't know why, but because it's very chaotic, but it is a lot of fun. And again, for me, podcasting, so many of my podcasts are like, even if I wasn't recording this, I would want to have this conversation. I would want to talk to these people about this. So we're just putting the mics on and like, you know, making it part of the show. And I think that to me is my favorite kind of podcast is I don't know, I really want to talk to people that I have fun talking to.
Just an organic conversation that would happen naturally. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So going back to not playing, is there a show that was recommended to you that you hadn't seen yet that you were really surprised? Was there a movie?
I'm trying to think what in our first season, we covered like a lot of ground in the first season that we did, which was now like, oh man, more than a decade ago, I think. And so some of the movies that we had like seen in the first season, oh man, a lot of comedies, 80s comedies I had missed out a lot. I had never seen National Lampoon's Vacation, for example, which was like, I was like, I don't know, we didn't really watch like 80s comedies in my house that much. Coming to America, Beverly Hills Cop, like a lot of these movies that were just sort of we were very much in like an 80s genre, I think the first time, especially. I was born in 1980, so I was just too young for a lot of these movies when they came out. And similarly, my friend Lex is, despite being a nerd, he is not like deep into the sci-fi fantasy stuff. Like, so we definitely watched movies that he would never watch, like Bill and Ted or some of the other ones, like even like Die Hard. He'd never seen Die Hard. I was like, what are you doing? You've never seen Die Hard? And so I don't know, that was half the fun of it, being like, how can you've never seen this seminal film in the like touchstone that everybody knows? And yeah, I feel like I have a slight one up on him there because I had definitely seen more of these things. I'd gone through at some point and like, oh, I'm going to go through the back catalog and see all those movies I didn't see. I've still missed a few, but yeah.
So it sounds like all of your hobbies have kind of turned into like a job in a way.
Yep.
So what do you do to stay sane?
Oh, I ask myself this more often than not. Like, I do not really have a lot of hobbies these days. It is kind of the closest I have, and I haven't done as much of it recently. I'm a big D&D player. I do have a podcast where we play D&D in the air, but I also have non-podcast D&D campaigns, and I think that for me is one of my biggest ones because I'm playing with like friends I've known for years, and it's also just a good chance to like talk to, like, you know, some of us live more far-flung now, and so it just has a great opportunity to catch up with all those people, and that for me is very rewarding. Beyond that, I don't know. I've been looking for a better hobby. I keep like dabbling in stuff, like, oh, maybe I'll do some more baking or something like that. And I occasionally do for like a little bit, but I haven't really found anything that I'm like super into and just want to like, I play video games. Sometimes I talk about them on podcasts, but like, I don't even know if I call that a hobby so much as a pastime. It doesn't really take any skill. Like, so I don't know. I'm in the market for a good hobby, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, whatever it takes to, clear your mind, to step away from real life, to kind of, have that palate cleanser. Video games, if that's what you're into, like,
Yeah,
it doesn't really matter.
that's a big one. I take my kid to the playground. That's a good way to like chill out and just not stare at my phone for an hour. I think that's pretty valuable time.
Right. Any time spent with kids is valuable. And
Yeah.
it's really one of those checkups that, like, okay, like, I spend all my time in these fantastical worlds, either writing or watching movies or doing podcasts, but like, this kid and my wife, they're the reality. Like, that's
Yeah.
what
Well,
grounds
it's
me.
and nice to step away from a screen too, I think every once in a while. I do so much of my work in front of a computer and it's fine. I don't I find it okay, but like it is good to just, get out in the world and, fresh air and all that stuff. I hear that's great.
You're not sold on it though, huh?
Yeah, it's, my wife will tell you, she keeps trying to get me to go camping more. And I was like, nah, it's not really my thing. I'm not really I don't mind taking a walk, but like, let's not overdo it.
Right. So I'm kind of curious. You said you were a web developer. Is that not,
Yeah,
or
very briefly, a long time ago. I still dabble a little bit, but
how did you get into the tech writing and being a contributor to a magazine? Like, how did that transition? How did you, for somebody who wants to write for, not necessarily a tech magazine, but there's plenty of fantasy and science fiction magazines out there. Like, how did you kind of
yeah.
get your foot in the door there?
Yeah, I mean, so let's see. So after college, so my degree is in English first of all. So like my background was all in writing, but I love technology. I've always just been really interested in it as a teenager. I was always like messing around with the old Mac LC that we had, and I just enjoyed like tinkering and figuring stuff out. And so even when I was in college, and I was like studying English, like I worked at like I did technology teaching for a little while. Like I taught courses on using Photoshop or doing web writing stuff for the web. I was also the guy who like fixed all my friends' computers when they broke, and I like worked summers at like a part-time job where I worked in IT essentially at a university library. And so I would, help support the staff there and fix computers and roll out new computers. And it was just like really basic work, but I enjoyed it. And I started dabbling more and more. I did a little more programming. Many years ago, my friends and I worked on like a web comic. And so I had like one friend who was doing a bunch of the development, and then he was kind of flaky at times and would like go off and do other stuff. And so I learned how to fix all the problems and sort of taught myself how to do that. And so when I got out of school and I was like, I don't really know what I'm doing, I went back to my old like summer job and like was like working there full time for a little bit, but I needed something a little bit more full time. So I went and found another job also at the university that was doing kind of the stuff, hey, fix these computers for a small research program and also help them build their websites. And again, this was like 2003, so it was a very different world for those things. And I was all self-taught. I had no certifications, nothing. But I always wanted to keep writing. And like at a certain point after spending a couple of years doing that technology work, I was getting burned out and I was like, I don't know, this is not really what I wanted to do with my life. So I remember one day I wrote like, I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna write a list of all the jobs I would like to have and see if there's anything interesting in there. And I had all sorts of like, I was like, it's pie in the sky. It could be whatever you want. I had like writer for the Daily Show in there because I thought that would be awesome, right? But for years and years, I had been a big reader of Macworld magazine. I'm a big Apple fan. I'd spent a lot of time. All my computers were Macs, and I was like, "Oh man, it'd be cool to write for Macworld. Like, I know how to write. I know a lot about technology. Maybe there's something for me there." And I emailed the editor because at the bottom of his like editor's desk column every month there would be, hey, send me an email if you've got a question or a thought or something. I was like, all right. So I emailed him. I was like, oh, how do you get into this business? Like, where do you start? And he wrote me back this really nice email. It's like, oh yeah, well, I would try this site maybe. Like they accept some freelance pieces. Maybe there's something you could pitch to them. And I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. That sounds great. And then I did nothing about it for like a year. And then I hit that breaking point where I was like, okay, I'm done with the job. I'm quitting. And I took some time off. I traveled a little bit. And part of that was going out at the time in San Francisco. They did the Macworld conference. And I was like, I'm going to go there. I've always wanted to go. I haven't had a chance. So I flew out there, went to the conference. And while I was wandering around the floor, I saw this editor that I'd emailed like 2 years ago. Excuse me. And I was like, oh well, I'll say hi. I've made it up. Like one of the things in my life that I do is I always just go up and talk to people that I feel like that I know by reputation. I like even if it's just say like, hey, I love your work. I just want to let you know that. Nice to meet you. Um, and so I went up to him and was like, hey, I love your work. I emailed you about this stuff. Thank you for your advice. I really appreciate it. And do you have any jobs? And he's like, well, we're not really hiring, but we are starting a blog. Like we kind of do the more magazine stuff, but we're starting a blog because that was kind of where things were at that point, and we're looking for contributors to that. So like, shoot me an email. I had like no chill and like sent them an email immediately. And after a while, started like a month or two later, started writing these pieces for this blog, and it was like I think I was getting paid $7 for a post. It was
Oh
not
wow.
high paying work. I did not have a job at this point. So I was like, well, any money coming in, I'd like move back in with my parents. And they're like, okay, so yeah, let's say we'll pay you $7 a post, and we'll say you can write a maximum of 100 posts in a month. And I'm like, well, that is a goal. So I wrote 100 posts, and then the next month, and I just kept writing like the maximum that we let me do every month. And after about a year, I had done a couple. They'd asked me to do a couple freelance things for the magazine. And then after a year, they're like, it's too expensive to pay you all this money that we're paying. They'd started another blog I was working on. I kept doing pieces, and they're like, it's too expensive. We're just going to hire you. I was like, okay. So they started me off as like I was like an associate editor or something. And it was great. I mean, it was just kind of dumb luck and like being a little willing to put myself out there. I think that was the big part. Again, I had so much writing background from school and everything that I again, I could string some words together, and that really helped. It showed when I was submitting like pieces to them for their like trials. They're like, yeah, you seem like you can do this. And so it just kind of grew from there. I've been very lucky in my career to have these opportunities, and I certainly recognize my own privilege in being able to take time off and have the like flexibility and comfort levels in my income, et cetera, to be able to pursue those kinds of opportunities. But a lot of it has just been kind of trying to, find my way and like ask people for help. Hey, how do you do this? Or like, where do I start? Like, I have found people to be generally pretty helpful with their time and generous with their time when it comes to those kinds of questions. And I try, as a result, when I've had people come to me and ask, like, where do I start? Where do I go? I always try to return that favor because people have been so nice to me. I was like, well, the least I can do is turn around and like, give somebody else whatever advice I might have on a subject.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that it was luck a couple times, and I don't. From what you told me, it might have been, but like you took a chance, like you were willing to put yourself out there. You when they told you how many blog posts you could post in a month, you said challenge accepted. Like you put the work in to have that luck. Um,
Yeah, it's a
but
part. I mean, I think you can't. My philosophy is that you try to maximize your opportunities, like your opportunities to get lucky. Like there's always some degree of chance at play there. But the more and more you do stuff or the more you put yourself out there, you're kind of like it's like increasing your available surface area. Like the more chances you have to put yourself out there, the better a chance that when that opportunity comes along, you'll be positioned well to like jump into it.
exactly, and not being afraid to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you'll be surprised at how willing. Well, you won't because you've had this experience, but like you that are watching, you'd be surprised at how many people are actually willing to help people out if you just reach out to them. Whether that's your favorite author or an editor of a magazine or whatever it is, like you'd be surprised at how many people are like,
Yeah,
yeah, like I'm okay. Like you can contact me or email me, and I'll see what I can do.
yeah, absolutely.
So I was reading your fourth book, the Armageddon Protocol just came out last month.
Mhm.
So that was your fourth book in the series, right?
Yeah, it depends how you count. This is the weird thing. So my first book, my debut, is not technically in this series, but it is basically set in the same world, follows the same characters. So yeah, 4 or 5, depending on how you
Depending
count.
on how you
It's a
count.
weird situation.
So it took you, about a decade or so to put out your first book, and this is the fourth or fifth book, depending on how you want to count in the last 7 years. Um, what have you done to like increase your productivity, or like how has your productivity increased just based on repetition?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, as I to reiterate my earlier point, I think you can't, to a certain degree, you can't help but get better at something the more you do it. And so, writing more books and getting more familiar with um, the feeling of it, the pace, the phrasing, the structure of a novel. Like as you get more familiar with that by having done it several times, it gets easier. Like it doesn't get, I would say it never gets like easy. Like I think you get better. I've heard the old saying is like, you never learn how to write a novel. You only learn how to write the novel you're working on right now. Because everyone's a little bit different, but there are lessons that you take away and lessons that you learn as you're going through and being like, oh, I saw that pitfall before. Like I remember how I fixed that last time, or I remember what I did last time. And some of it is just sheer bloody perseverance. Like knowing that you've done it before is like, I've done this 5 times. I know I can do it again, even if I'm sort of like Kool-Aid manning my way through a wall and just being like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think that's a big part of it for me, is just like realizing that I have managed to do this before. And as a result, it's something that I can do again. And so, productivity wise, it has enabled me to take some of the pressure off. I don't necessarily write every day. Don't write on weekends generally anymore, but I do write every weekday. I still consider that part of my job. But also sometimes stuff gets in the way. And it's like, I don't beat myself up about that. If I miss a day, it's like, all right, well, I missed a day. Tomorrow, back at it. I think that's the most important thing for me, is it's really the times I've struggled the most are the times when I let that kind of get away from me, and I'll go like several days or a week and I'll be like, oh man, I really have not gotten any words down. But again, there's no point in beating yourself up about it. You just, the next day you sit down and you start working on it again. So again, I think that's my biggest lesson that I've taken away from all of this after having produced this many books, is like, sit down and do the work. And like ultimately, again, it's the only thing you can control. And let me tell you, having been through the publishing gauntlet a lot, there are a lot of things you cannot control in publishing, the majority even.
Right.
So focus on the things that you can do.
Right, it's the expectation. Like I've already done this before, like I can do it again. My dad, I was a wrestler growing up. My dad was my coach all the way up through high school. When I was a youngster, like I was frustrated because I'd lose and I wouldn't get a medal or whatever. Now they just give medals everywhere. But he told me, like, if you can get in the championship of a tournament once, you'll get it again. And if you can take first once, you'll be able to do it again. It'll be easy to do it the next time. And he was exactly right. The minute, when I took second for the first time, I was like, yeah, I can do this. When I
Mm-hmm.
took first the first time, it was like, oh yeah. So every tournament after that, I already had the expectation, like they have to beat me to get first. Like I'm going in there and I'm taking it. And it's
Nice.
just that expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a mindset. It really is. And I think it helps if you start from the mindset of, I can do this. Like I think, and that's a challenge. Everybody going in, like, it's intimidating to go into writing a book and being like, oh man, I don't know. Like it's a lot of work. It's a big long thing. And like there's all these books that don't make it, whatever. But like you do need some degree of believing in yourself and persevering in yourself to actually get to that point. Otherwise you're defeating yourself right from the beginning.
Exactly. No, you definitely have to have a belief in yourself. Now, let's touch on All Souls Lost. So what's the genesis for that? What's the story behind that?
So the story for that is I started working on it. I don't know. I think I'd gotten a couple of my first 2 science fiction books at least written, and I was like, I want to do something totally different, something in a totally different genre. And once again, I told you, like, my move is like take 2 things I like and smash them together. So love detective and noir novels, especially. Love kind of like supernatural, spooky things, and I was like, I'm gonna put these together and like, I'm not claiming I invented this genre. Obviously, the subgenre has been around for a very long time, whether you call it urban fantasy or supernatural detective stories or what have you. But I love that feel, especially there was a book series by an author named Mike Carey called the Felix Castor series, which I loved. It's set in London. It's about this guy who's like a freelance exorcist, but it had such a good tone and vibe to it. It was funny and dry, but also creepy and weird. And I was kind of like, oh, I want to write a book like that. So I started working on this book that follows a supernatural consultant named Mike Lucifer, who works in my hometown of Somerville, Massachusetts, because I decided I wanted to not have to invent an entire world. I'll just use the world I already live in. And he basically comes back after having been away for a couple of years because his partner died, and he gets embroiled in this case that involves some shady goings on at a big tech company. And this is one place I did kind of draw from my expertise. Like, I wanted to pull in some stuff about technology and big tech and things like that. And so it's a little bit techno thriller too. I sometimes joke it's half detective story, half supernatural book, and half techno thriller. But I so much of it for me was about the voice of the character. It's all first person. You're very much in Mike's head, and he's kind of like a talk a mile a minute guy. He doesn't necessarily have he knows a little bit of magic, but he's not really a magician. He's got, I think, something that resonates very much with me is he's just sort of a persevering guy. It's like your classic, hard-boiled detectives where it's like they keep getting beat up, but they keep getting up and like, oh, I gotta find the truth. And so Mike gets beat up a lot, but it's fun and funny and hopefully a little bit creepy. That's not always something that it's in my wheelhouse to write, but I felt like I wanted to tell this somewhat eerie story. And so I really enjoyed writing it. I'm hoping to do a sequel to it at some point. I've got some ideas in my head, but it is something I just haven't been able to move to the top of my pile. But it was a lot of fun to write. It's one of my favorite books. I think it's probably my least visible. I appreciate it. I don't know what the right word is. I think a lot of people like it. It just I haven't managed to quite get it into the popular zeitgeist there. But I think it deserves to be read by more people. And hey, it's October. It's spooky season. It's a good time to pick it up.
Sounds fantastic. I'll check both of your series out. Go ahead, Dan, and tell people how they can get a hold of you and
Sure.
hold of your books.
Yeah, you can find out everything about me at my website, which is dmoren.com, dmoren.com. You'll find links to all of my books at all popular booksellers. You'll find links to all my podcasts as well as my tech writing. And you can also find me on pretty much every social media network because that's how things are in 2024. I am usually at dmoren or some variation of that. So I'm not too difficult to find. You also just Google Dan Moren. There are other ones, but I'm definitely the first one.
Now, have any plans for any upcoming cons that you're going to?
I will
People can meet
be,
you?
I'll be at BossCon in February. That's the only one currently on my schedule. I am planning on being at Worldcon in Seattle next year if I can just make sure the logistics on that fit. But I would love to. I love Seattle. Really want to get out there again. Those are the ones on my firm calendar. If an opportunity arises, I may show up another one. I'd love to come back to Dragonsteel. I haven't really seen if that's going to happen this year or not for me, but it is something I would love to do because I really enjoyed it last year.
Perfect. So reach out, get your books, get his books for you people that are watching. And if you see him at a con, go ahead and say hi.
Yeah,
Dan,
please
I
do.
appreciate you getting on today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Thank you for listening to the Troy Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and share with your friends.